So, in essence, we were not getting information from the science advisory group set up by the chief scientific advisor. There is no transparency in the way science advice is going into government. When I was chief scientific advisor, it was well known to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown that I would take advice from a group of experts and then take that advice into them, but also put it into the public domain. That is a critically important way of operating, because when ministers say we are following science advice, there's no way in which we in the public domain can tell whether or not that is correct. Whereas if the chief scientific advisor is able to frankly put advice into the public domain, then we know what that advice was. That's the first thing. But the second thing was to gather a group of experts together who I thought could manage to give good advice, not just epidemiologists, but also public health experts, etc. So I've got a relatively small group, 14 people, but they cover very different aspects of the situation. And everyone would know that public health is a critical part of that. So we have good representation from public health. So it was a question of not only showing how we thought that it ought to operate. Our advice goes into government, but it also goes straight into the public domain, and our first meeting was held in the public.
Yes, I remember.
Right.
Unprecedented is an overused word. Is there any defence of the government's decision not to share the science that they profess to be following so closely? Is there any defence of it that could be filed under the unprecedented nature of this crisis? I was told by at least two journalists, very, very closely connected to Downing Street, that they couldn't share the science in case it embarrassed our allies who were pursuing a different course.
Good Lord. That's the first time I've heard that one. And I've heard many...
Well, I'll DM you their names after this.
Right. So I think all I can say is each of these reasons being given is incredible. Yes. Literally incredible. I think that the government is running a top-down process. Everything is run from number 10. I think that people like Dominic Cummings clearly have a big role in this. And the Science Advisory Group really has to follow what situation they are set by those people. Right. So what we're told today is that the reason why the critically important part of managing an epidemic, which is if anyone shows symptoms, get them tested. If they test positive, trace all of their contacts over the last 14 days, put each of those contacts into isolation for a further 14 days. If you follow that routine, you can come to the end of an epidemic very quickly, as we've seen, for example, in Greece. They're completely over this epidemic with a total number of deaths of 150 people because they followed that. We came into with testing quite late, but nevertheless we were testing and tracing, and then we stopped doing that. Now we're told that the reason is because we didn't have the testing capacity. What is simply amazing for me is we're not using GPs to do taking blood samples and having them tested. I'm just astounded that we have brought in a private company to run the testing and tracing process. So
we've got Serco, G4S, Deloitte were involved originally with the testing of NHS workers, and you as a former chief scientific advisor find that impossible to understand, or at least to justify.
I couldn't see how it could be justified because, frankly, your GP has your medical records. Your GP is the person who you would go to for an annual flu jab. It just seems to run in the face of common sense. So there seems
careful with the common sense for David.
Right. But I am feeling extremely frustrated because we have brilliant scientists in this area. I would say we led the world 20 years ago, and if the Chinese and the Koreans and people in Hong Kong have done this well, it's because actually we taught them. And it seems to me that we threw all of that rule book out of the door.
Yesterday, I think it's fair to say that some tensions began to emerge between politicians and the scientists. We heard Therese Coffey suggest that if they'd done anything wrong, it would be the fault of the scientists, a sort of half-hearted slap down from Downing Street. And then the press conference last night where the prospect of primary schools reopening without having contact tracing demonstrably fit for purpose and in place seemed to recede slightly against the professed wishes of many politicians. Do you think it's inevitable that this cannot hold, the centre cannot hold, as politicians say the scientists did it, and the scientists say, well, no, all we did was give you that, then something's going to break?
I think that the scientists on the SAGE committee are in a difficult position, because I believe they were set some containment. They were put in a fenced area and said, you've got to do it under these conditions. Sorry, no more tests available. Stop the test and trace. Not because that was the sensible thing to do. The sensible thing to do would have been to get the test and trace process up and running through our GPs.
And, of course, that means that it was never the science that was being followed so much as the size of the stockpiles. Yes.
And I would say exactly the same with PPE for people in care homes, for people in hospitals, of course, a priority, but also in care homes. We never, in Greece, in February, they sent ships out to China to get all of this stuff. We did nothing in February, it seems, to get ourselves into a prepared state for managing a pandemic. There is a rational explanation that could be used, which is that actually we were following a route of herd immunity. And I think that would have been an act of desperation by the chief scientific advisor, saying, well, if we can't test and trace, we'll go for herd immunity.
Oh, I see.
So if that is the case, then we have this very large number of deaths per head of population, probably the largest in the world, which is a follow-through from the herd immunity program.
Yes.
I don't know what the policy is right now, but it does, I'm afraid, look very chaotic. I'm saying all of this ahead of the next report from the independent SAGE group, and that report is going to be specifically on the going back to school from 1st of June.
And can you give us an indication of what's likely to be in it?
What I can tell you is the process. So the group has been literally working right through the weekend, almost all last night. And we are in the process of producing a preliminary report, and then on Friday we will hold a public meeting open to parents, to teachers, to the unions to come in and comment on our report.
Okay.
So there are a lot of things to respond to. First, I want to look at transparency. So, of course, there is zero transparency when it comes to Tory governments. And this one in particular is extremely secretive about the information it receives. Now, what happens is SAGE, the scientific advisory group, provide information to the government, advice to the government on, for example, this pandemic. Now, the government are not publishing this advice. Why are they not doing that? I believe it's because they want to protect the government from mistakes that they have made. The advice would, for example, suggest massive testing, but because there is not enough capacity, the government would have to reject that advice. So if they published the advice saying you need to test, and they didn't test, they would be in serious trouble. You have to remember there's always this fear of a public inquiry down the road. And Boris Johnson and his deputies want to protect themselves in every way possible. Now, the next point is the lack of capacity for testing. So at the beginning, there was the lie that there was sufficient capacity to test. But at the same time, many members of the NHS who were seeking a test were refused a test. We saw in the media a number of testing facilities, even drive-through testing facilities. But of course, these were not functioning correctly because they lacked staff and equipment. Matt Hancock and other government spokespeople presented the number of 100,000 tests a day by the end of April. But when the end of April arrived and they had to reach that target, they posted out tens of thousands of tests. So these were not tests actually completed, but they were posted out to people. And posted out to people who were not able, they didn't have the ability to carry out these tests correctly. Now, a potentially sinister aspect of all of this is the idea of having a private company doing the testing. Why was this the choice of the government? As James O'Brien's guest had said, why were GPs not asked? They were the best people on the ground to carry out these tests. They had records of their patients. But instead, the government went with a private company. Why did they do that? Why is a private company collecting data on the public regarding this virus? And also, how does Dominic Cummings play into this? Is this about collecting data for some particular reason? And why was he sitting in on SAGE meetings? Why was he involved in these meetings? Considering the shenanigans surrounding Cambridge Analytica last year, I think Dominic Cummings should stay as far away as possible from a SAGE meeting. So who is going to get blamed for all of the mistakes that have been made during this crisis? Well, you can be sure that the government will not get blamed. They will, of course, shift the blame onto someone else. Now, it's looking more and more likely at this stage that the scientists will take the blame. They gave bad advice. The government acted on their advice. And therefore, by being opaque with the actual information that was presented by the SAGE group and not releasing it to the public, the government can defend their position this way. They can say this information is secret, it's sensitive, we can't release it to the public, and therefore makes it much easier for them to blame the scientists. And unfortunately, I think the public have bought into this idea that experts are not to be listened to. Let's go back to Brexit once again. The public have been convinced that the scientists, the experts, the people who know one end of a problem from the other are not to be listened to, but politicians are to be listened to. But don't worry, it won't be just the scientists who will be blamed. Of course, the public will be blamed also. The fact that the government are giving out mixed messages to workers and bad advice, ridiculous advice actually, to the public, such as to stay alert and not stay at home, it makes it easier for the government to blame the public when things go badly. So the government can wash their hands and say, look, we did everything we could. We told the public to stay alert, and in the end they didn't, and that's not our fault. We kept up our side of the social contract. So why did Britain not reach out to other countries for help? Why did they not follow advice given by the EU, for example? Why did they not look at other countries who were succeeding and attempt to emulate what they were doing? Now, I think, unfortunately, Brexit plays a role here. I think this Brexit mentality has infected, like a virus, the minds of the government, so that they think in this little England empire mentality. We know better than everyone else. We can go it alone. We are an independent country. We can do whatever we want and no one can stop us. And we don't need to listen to foreigners or foreign entities who are attempting to tell us what to do. No, we know best and we will decide for ourselves, irrespective of the damage it's going to do to our country and to our society and to people's lives, just like Brexit. Now, finally, I just want to talk about the issue of herd immunity, and I think we should have seen the warning signs. Back in March, Boris Johnson addressed the nation in a very serious and somber way, and he talked about how many family members are going to lose loved ones, that many people are going to die. And I think at that stage, the writing was on the wall, that herd immunity was the order of the day. And unfortunately, that was the direction the government were heading. So were the decisions taken ultimately by the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to protect the NHS? I don't know. Were they to save lives? I don't know. Were they to protect the economy? I honestly don't know. But I am sure that at the back of it all, the objective has always been to protect the party, the Conservative Party, first and foremost. Let me know in the comments, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are much appreciated. Thanks. Why not become a Patreon and enjoy access to our Discord server where we share news, chat, and have some fun? If you become a patron, you can also make video suggestions on topics that are important to you. Check it out via the link in the description.